People throw in there where they're joining from, but welcome. My name is Sam Gralty. I'm the events manager with Vermont Land Trust, and welcome to Old Growth Forest Characteristics, the what, the how, and the why. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're not familiar with Vermont Land Trust, we're a membership organization dedicated to protecting farmland, forest land, and community lands across the state. Since 1977, we've protected 640,000 acres, which equates to roughly 11% of the state. A few quick Zoom housekeeping reminders. We are recording this, but because it's a webinar, you won't appear in the recording. If you have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A feature. In a minute, I will be shutting down the main webinar chat. I'll be monitoring the Q&A as we move along, and we'll have time at the end to answer some of those. As people are putting things in the chat, you can also give someone else's question a thumbs up if you're also interested in hearing that, and I'll tend to emphasize the ones that have the most interest from everyone. Let's see, if you're having tech issues, you can also put questions into the chat for me, and I'll do my best to respond to those. And if you are interested in having closed captions available, those should be available at the bottom of your screen. So yeah, without further ado, we're thrilled to be joined this afternoon by ecologist Liz Thompson, as well as VLT forester David McMath. And I will pass it off to Liz and David to begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam, and thanks everyone for being here. It's so great to see people coming from all over the place and some good friends. So we're going to talk today about old growth forests, what they are, why they're important, and how to protect them. I'll be talking a little bit about the first part, and then David will talk about some strategies for protecting old growth forests, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So starting, here's the four things we're going to talk about in our talk. What is old growth? Do we need old growth? And if so, why? Managing for old growth characteristics and wildlands as future old growth. So what is old growth forest? Well, old growth forests were the predominant land cover in our region prior to European settlement, covering about 90% of the land area. And today, less than 0.1% of the land area is occupied by old growth forests. And this is just a little bit of land use history. These are the Harvard Forest dioramas in Massachusetts, showing the history of the landscape in Massachusetts. The same view, looking at it here a little bit later, and here a little bit later, the height of clearing. And then here is a diagram of New England forest cover and human population over the years from Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, a publication that came out in 2017. So you can see there was this height of land clearing in the mid to late 1800s throughout New England. And Vermont and New England are reforesting now, but the forests are quite young. So this is the reforestation of the landscape. And the current forests that we have today are mostly ecologically young, what we call second growth forests. They are forests that are, some people refer to them as teenage forests. So forests that are really, in the first third of their life cycle or so. And this is another way of looking at it here. This is a diagram of forest succession. And you can see on the left, pre-forest, young forest, mature forest, old forest, and really on the right is old growth forest. And where we are is approaching maturity, but certainly not old forest yet for most of our forests. And what is an old growth forest? An old growth forest, as we define it, is a forest that has operated under natural ecological processes for at least 3 to 4 centuries with only minimal human activity. So that's a pretty simple definition. It's simply natural ecological processes. Humans are part of this landscape and have been part of this landscape for millennia. But their influence on the forest prior to European settlement was quite minimal. Some other terms that we hear are primary forest, original forest, virgin forest, the forest, primeval, ancient forest, and ancient woodland. And those last two terms are commonly used in Europe, not so much in this country. But you'll hear some of those terms. The term virgin forest is sort of not really used anymore because it doesn't really have it's hard to define what that is. Some old growth forests, but not all, these are some characteristics that some old growth forests have. They have trees of many ages, and I'm just going to go, I'm not going to read this whole list right now because I'm going to go through it with pictures. Trees of many ages. So this is an old growth forest in Vermont that has some very old trees and many very young trees. This is Gifford Woods in Vermont. Some very large trees. Canopy gaps is a characteristic of many old growth forests. Downwood in all stages of decay, and that downwood serves as nurse logs. So you can see these yellow birch seedlings getting established on this mossy nurse log. A lot of standing deadwood or snags, and this provides habitat for birds, mammals, all kinds of creatures. That's Gifford Woods again. Tip-up mounds are common in old-growth forests, and this is a forest in New Hampshire with David Foster formerly from Harvard Forest. They have vast, well-developed mycorrhizal networks, and this is something we're just really, still learning a lot about, but really fascinating stuff. And here's a diagram from an article about this showing how these mycorrhizal networks, these fungal networks, under mycorrhizae are the underground parts of fungi, and showing how these fungal networks operate underground in older forests. They are so important in sharing of resources and sharing of information between trees. There are in many old growth forests abundant mosses, lichens, and fungi. And many old growth forests show seeming disarray. And this is a quote from Thoreau, where he, in the Northwoods, where the Maine woods, he hiked north into Maine, and he said it's all mossy and moosey. And I'd say it's also sometimes very messy. So here's some downwood, and this is a really interesting forest in New Hampshire and southwestern New Hampshire. This is the Pisgah forest, which, speaking of disarray, the living trees in this forest are young. And all the large trees fell down in the 1938 hurricane. So this place was completely toppled in the 1938 hurricane, yet we still consider it an old growth forest, even though the living trees are quite young. So because it's an old growth forest, because it's been operating under natural ecological processes primarily. And so they decided when this forest, they had designated it as an old growth forest, that it would be protected forever. And when this happened, there was some talk about, should they do salvage logging? What should they do? And they decided to simply leave it as it is. And so it's a very important research site now. So you might be wondering, have heard the term old forest. And how does that differ from old growth forests? Well, old forests is a broader term that means biologically mature forests with some characteristics of old growth forests, exhibiting minimal evidence of human-caused disturbance. So they're forests that might have old trees, that might have some of these attributes. They might have some standing deadwood, some snags they might be developing some of these attributes, but they have had some human influence in the past. Old forests are really, really important, and they are part of what we're talking about here. So you'll find that we'll use these terms a little bit interchangeably. So in order to get more old growth forest on the landscape, we really need to start with old forest and figure out how to get more of that on the landscape. Other terms for old forest are overmature forest, decadent forest, and middle-aged forest. I think decadent forest is kind of insulting, but oh well. So next topic, do we need old growth? Do we need old growth forests? And if so, why? Well, here's an article that appeared in Sierra magazine about 2 years ago. And the author says the Northeast has few pre-colonial forests left. Expanding the remaining patches may hold the key to ecological resilience in the centuries to come. I encourage you to go and have a look at this article because it makes a case that old forests do have importance in many different ways. And here's some reasons. And again, I'm not going to read this entire list here. Instead, I'm going to go through each one of them with pictures. So first of all, do we need old growth forests? And I am going to say, in my opinion, we do. And here are the reasons that I would put forward, or that many ecologists put forward as to why we do. Old forests simply have inherent value. They were the predominant land cover in our region, and today they occupy less than 1% of the region. So they simply have inherent value for that reason. 2, old forests provide ideal habitat for many species like Blackburnian warbler, barred owl, and certain lichens and mosses, among other things. And that's a Blackburnian warbler, like this lung lichen, Neckera moss. 3, the complexity of old forests creates a diversity of habitats, resulting in greater biological diversity. And this is a chart that shows that the diversity in different groups changes as the forest ages. So you can see that for plants, early in a forest development, that's the orange line, early in a forest development, the diversity of plants, the number of species per unit area is high. And then it drops very low in the middle-aged forests that are predominant on the landscape today, and then rises again as the forests get older. With animals, a similar trajectory, and with fungi, similar. Although, interestingly, the very, very oldest forests, the diversity of fungi decreases a little bit. So this is not just this is information that's been gathered. This study looked at many other studies and data to compile this. So this is actually not a fungus. This is a slime mold, which many people think of as fungi, but they're not. And this is in an old growth forest in Vermont. So deep duff layers and abundant down wood help old forests and old growth forests serve better than younger forests to provide hydrological regulation. So regulating water, regulating the flow of water through the landscape. Old forests do that better than younger forests because of the deep duff layer and downwood particularly falling into streams. Dynamic nature of old forests. All the fallen trees can provide protection for regeneration. So what do we mean by that? It's really hard we have an abundance of white-tailed deer in our landscape, and it's really hard for some trees to regenerate in the forest with the abundance of deer eating so many of the seedlings, but this complexity can protect those seedlings from that. Carbon. A lot of people are interested in carbon. Old forests store more carbon than younger forests, and much of that carbon is underground. That could be a whole webinar, and there's lots of different people talking about this and writing about this, but this is a nice publication that came out about 4 years ago, I think, from UMass and University of Vermont. With their complex structure, diversity of microhabitats and species-dense carbon, and all of these things we've been talking about, old forests are in many ways more resilient to climate change than younger forests. Old growth forests can serve as reference sites. This is a site in the Green Mountain National Forest that is a research site. You can see the numbers on the trees. They've been following these trees for many years. And finally, old forests offer humans places of refuge, mental and physical recharge. They inspire awe and a sense of wonder. And Barbara Kingsolver, I think, said it so well. People need wild places. We need to be able to taste grace and know once again that we desire it. So at this point, we're going to talk about 2 different strategies for getting more old growth forests or old forests on the landscape. And I'm going to turn it over to David now to talk about managing for old growth characteristics.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everyone. That was certainly a lot to digest, packed in a small time frame. So Liz kind of went over what everything is. So I think we all kind of agree there's some importance there. So what can we do to try to build some of these into our forests? So I think to start with, we might have to make sure we protect what we have, right? So certainly we have so little old growth left, it's a no-brainer to protect that. But in our other forests, we need to protect them and make sure that, they don't become parking lots and those kind of things. As Liz mentioned, our forests are ecologically young. This gives us some great opportunity going forward, but it also creates some challenges. Everything, all this stuff just takes so long. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And I find talking with folks about this stuff, if you're looking at this from a distance, it looks pretty simple, fairly black and white. But if you're a forester or even a landowner, you quickly learn that it gets very complex quickly. So there's no real easy answers. So Liz mentioned we have sort of these different approaches. We have a passive approach, was kind of letting nature take over as the manager. And then we have more active opportunities that we'll look at. But with the passive, a few things with the passive is it takes time. And I think this is what I want to hammer home on this one. It's not a quick turnaround. This can take centuries. Okay. Comparing that to a more active approach, it seems counterintuitive, but sometimes the active management can get you to this condition, where this desired condition, quicker. So want to take a look at that also. Let's see. I think the other thing with all this is we can focus on the forest and the conditions and all that, but then we have these other things like wildlife. We have landowner objectives, and can quickly become complicated. Okay. I just threw this slide in because I know for me as a forester, it's like, well, what are we trying to achieve? Like, when do we know we've gotten there? Say, well, we want to have big trees, we want to do this, but what are some things? So I'm not going to go over this, but it's a good place to start, especially for foresters. I know personally I was working on one recently where it got enrolled into the old forest category in the current use department here in Vermont. And when I first walked in on the property, you just knew right away something was a little bit different. But it wasn't until we really cruised it and got the inventory, and it's like, wow, we're hitting the minimums of those large trees. Unfortunately, we were down on the other ones. But another thing I want to hammer home too is that big doesn't always mean old, okay? Generally it does, but a couple situations, I know back in a previous life when I was logging, I was cutting in a cedar swamp, and I cut a tree that was probably 12 or 14 inches in diameter, cut it down. I just remember it well because had some cabin logs in it that were bringing a lot of money at the time. And as I was sharpening my saw, I looked down at the stump and I couldn't see the rings very easily. And I was like, huh. So I cleared the stump off and said, I'm going to count this. This looks really old. I had to stop it over just over 200. I couldn't see the growth rings anymore, and it was just getting too tedious. And it really made me pause to see that it was a 200-year-old tree. And then flip that recently on a hazard tree removal. It was a very nice white pine. It's probably 2 feet on the stump, and everyone was talking about how old that tree was. Well, I counted the rings after, and it was 56 years old. I'm 62, and this tree was massive. But so you have to be a little careful. And people ask me, like, well, how do you tell if it's old, looking at it? And one, it's not a foolproof way, but you can look at the bark. You know, if you're walking on the woodlot and someone says, "Oh, look at that maple, it's growing really well, it's got smooth bark." Well, you look at a maple that's been around for a couple hundred years, the bark looks very different. Example, I remember I was early on up in an old growth area in Maine called Big Reed, and I knew it was a white pine tree because I could see the tree, you know, the top of it. But when I was looking at the bark, it was really, it didn't look like any white pine I'd ever seen. So that's another good indication. Okay. So let's just take a quick look at passive management. Certainly a way forward. You're, again, letting nature take over. I think so what you're doing is you're relying on the natural disturbance regime that naturally happens. And this, like I mentioned that slide before, it takes a lot of time. It's definitely not going to happen overnight. The passive approach will favor your more tolerant species like hemlock, sugar maple, beech, red spruce, and tolerant means that they can still do well under shade. You're definitely going to maximize your carbon storage, as Liz mentioned. These really, as that tree gets larger, it really starts packing on the storage. Next slide. I do want to mention, though, the passive approach is not always suited for everything. Like take, for example, a plantation. Remember, you're starting with bare ground, you're planting, you're thinning, you're watching it grow, and at some point you're going to start over. You're going to do that final harvest and then replant. It's hard to mimic that in nature. I mean, there's not many situations. High concentrations of non-native species. You know, if you have a forest that's just choking everything out with, you know, honeysuckle or barberry, something like that, it's hard for nature to account for all that. Liz mentioned deer. It's a real problem in some areas. Or if you have a forest that's just been really poorly taken care of for a long time, and sometimes situations, they might be suited for some active work. So you need to choose wisely, or there's some opportunity to do some restoration work first. Maybe you could take care of some of those invasive species and kick that forest along and then turn to a passive approach. Okay. So let's take a quick look at some active work. The active strategies, they're a whole gradient of opportunity, and this is where it can really mesh a little bit better with landowner objectives and those kind of things. Okay. This is nothing new, folks. This has been thinking about this for a long time. Back in the 2000s, Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro kicked out some guides. There was, you know, positive feedback on those. Time has gone by, and you know, a lot of great research has been going on in the last 10, 20 years. Some very thoughtful people are thinking about this, trying to figure out how we balance everything. So a group got together, and Paul and Tony came out with a revised guide. Strongly encourage folks to download this, give it a read. It's written for a broad range of audience. I found as a forester very helpful. Gives me some sort of hands-on things I can do. It's also very helpful for landowners that don't quite understand this, getting pressure from all sides to figure out where maybe they can fit into this. Okay. I pulled this right out of the guide, and again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's just, it kind of takes all the different components and kind of puts it into a sort of more graphical representation. So you can kind of really get in a handle of like, okay, if I wanted to be totally passive, what are some of the trade-offs? What are some of the positive attributes? And then over to, you know, maybe not doing a whole lot. I think I share the belief that many others that, you know, we needed this variety of strategies. You know, very important to have some of these wildland reserves. but then to continue to have some active management going on too. And I think it's that biodiversity across the landscape that we're trying to keep going. I guess my point is that one size doesn't fit all in this situation. Okay. I want to throw this in too. I know when I was in school many moons ago, we talked about economic maturity. We were focused on getting that forest growing as fast as it can, producing as much fiber as possible, while still taking care of the other attributes. We didn't talk about biological maturity, and it wasn't until well after school that a similar chart like this came across my desk, and I was actually quite floored to see that a northern white cedar, common tree up my way, can be over 1,000 years old. That's just, I still wonder if I can really wrap my head around that. You know, white pine, 400, red pine, 500, eastern hemlock, 500. You know, time frames that are just not something that we even talk about. Next slide. So let's jump right in. Sort of some active thing. So any active restoration, my belief is, has to be have a strong silvicultural foundation to it. Even age, uneven age management, all these things. So you need, if you're a landowner, you need to find a forester, develop a management plan. You need that foundation to then you can build in these other strategies. You know, again, this is nothing new either. You know, ecological forestry, forestries of birds, all great stuff, tweaking of that original sort of our foundation of silviculture. A mentor of mine, good friend Ross Morgan up in Craftsbury, has a small library of the history of forestry, and he has some books from Germany. Talks about the Forstmeister, you know, and it talks about passing on this information to the next generation. And it wasn't to maximize the rate of return. This was to make sure that there was a forest there for the future. So again, base all this on silviculture. Let's see, okay, next. Let's just kind of jump in some practices. So Liz mentioned a lot of these characteristics are out there. So how can we build these? First one, I think is a great place to start, is your legacy trees. So these are trees that you're going to just never cut. You're going to let them live and do their thing. And when I was consulting in initial interviews with landowners, I'd ask them about, do you have a favorite tree? Where is it? Why? Let's go look at it. And 80% of the time, it was some big old tree that had been left there. You know, it was, next slide. So a whole host of things. These, obviously, we mentioned carbon storage, wildlife habitat. You know, I think about the tree. There's a tree in Craftsbury, probably 50, 60 inches around. It's a yellow birch. I came around the back side of it, and there was a big hole in it. And it had been made by a logger. And they'd cut into it and realized it was rotten, so they went on to the next tree. Beautiful wildlife tree. Probably a small child could have crawled up in that. There's usually, if they're healthy and they're growing, great seed source. Always, you know, those tops, they're just throwing a lot of seed. Eventually it's going to die. It's going to fall over, so your coarse wood material. And give some structural diversity also. You know, you have some large trees, small trees, different canopy layers. Tip-ups, Liz mentioned these. This is another one. This picture's not great, but it's the most incredible tip-up. That wasn't that huge of a tree, but the ball, it's just this big root ball with all the dirt, and creates a lot of microhabitats. And typically these older trees, you're going to find some of those mosses and lichens and that kind of thing. Okay. So moving along, you have your legacy trees. Eventually they're going to die. Standing dead trees are another really important component. They're easy to recruit. You can take a live tree, you can girdle it. So that's basically cutting around. You're cutting a couple inches in through the xylem and phloem and breaking that that, and that will eventually kill the tree. Usually do a couple of them. That middle picture, it's if you can see, the right-hand side was already dead, and then the other side wasn't. So we decided that'd be a great one to have a nice double snag. In the carbon world, when you're out inventorying, usually the trees are graded 1 through 5. So 1 would be recently dead, still have a lot of fine branching, and still solid, and then down to 5, which would be just kind of a stub, maybe, you know, the bark's sloughing off. You could almost push it over if you weren't careful. And it's nice to have a variety of those throughout the woods. You know, back in the day, we would just knock them down and run them over, which wasn't the worst thing, but still there's no need for that. And when trees die, they don't just die and then fall over. They break down slowly, and you can watch this. We've been watching a couple of cottonwoods near our house. Incredible bird life in them. We've seen 3 or 4 different kinds of hawks. We've watched a barred owl there last summer for quite a while. A couple squirrels nests in there to my delight, that come over to the house. But so it's you know, making sure you have those. Sugar makers sometimes struggle with them because they're out in the woods a lot more. They can be a hazard, and by all means, cut it down. It's still going to be going into the soil, but maybe if you're a sugar maker and you have an area of your woods that you don't tap heavily, you know, you're not tapping, maybe you leave more there standing, things like that. Let's see, next slide. So again, now we have these dead trees. They're going to fall over because comes into our coarse wood material. And I find in a lot of my work with this that this is the one area that's really lacking in our managed forest because we simply cut the trees out. We're removing product. But again, like snags, these can be easily recruited. We started doing this about 30 years ago, and we didn't do it all at once, right? You're not going to suddenly make 10 dead trees on the ground. So when we started harvesting, our goal was to have 1 tree per acre, and like legacy tree, bigger is better. And, you know, they're great food source once they fall over for a whole host of critters. Incredible soil builder. And sometimes, I think Liz mentioned it, the nurse log. So you'll have a tree fall over, starts decaying, and you'll get new life out of it. And some people have complained about this, that this is a, you know, economic hit, that kind of thing. I'm not suggesting, or anyone's suggesting, that you're toppling over or cutting down the veneer trees that your family has been tending, your grandfather or grandmother, whatever, for years. You know, you're picking the low quality trees typically. And when you really do the math, once the return to the landowner often is it's cents on the dollar. And we're not, you know, so it's not that big of a hit. Choose wisely. You know, if you're doing even age management or whole tree removal where you're taking the whole tree out, try leaving a couple bundles of trees out there. Don't pull everything, you know, scatter it around. I think of pine stands where they have these huge, you know, big pine trees and the upper logs, you can still sell them, but the mill doesn't really want those logs. They're taking them so they get the rest of the tree. The logger is spending, you know, 10, 15 minutes limbing all the limbs off. Just leave those in the woods. The economic is not a big deal, and those are wonderful food for the soil, basically. Okay, next one, yep. So last one's a little more difficult. You know, how to recruit a lot of the mosses and fungi and all that lichens. So what I've seen and what we've tried to do is, when you say you're recruiting legacy trees, pick the one that's got some lichen on it. I was in a stand in Greensboro. It was a mixed wood stand, so it had softwood and hardwood trees. It would be cut very hard, but they'd left some scattered trees around, which was good. And one of them was a red maple that had just covered in some lichen. and it was still growing, full sun. I mean, the regeneration was coming up great. So again, that can have an impact. If you found like a patch of mushrooms, maybe you don't cut any trees right there. Maybe you have a little, we call them skips, a little bit of retention that you just leave that alone. Okay. So just to kind of wrap up real quick, again, you need that silvicultural base to build from there and then build your long-term planning. You have lots of choices. Even a little bit can go a long way. I've been in some really big, even-aged operations, like big clear cuts and that kind of stuff. And they purposely left quarter-acre retention blocks. They just left blocks of uncut, no one's going to bother. Leaving single trees, right? Those legacy trees. And then a lot of times they've been left for whatever reason. Continue to leave them there. All this stuff, this will help that forest, survive what's coming down. There's a lot of things out there. And again, the bottom line is you got to keep the forest, and you need some really good estate planning, because this is over generations and even centuries, and that's just even hard to comprehend that. So I'm going to kick it back to Liz. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you. You talked about some really some strategies that people can use, that land managers, forest managers can use to bring some of these characteristics back to the landscape.
And I would say that these are really important to keep in mind
for people who are engaged in active management and want to be engaged in active management and want to move these things along more quickly. And then I would also say that wildlands, that most forests actually don't need us. Most forests can do fine all by themselves. They can manage, they can gain ecological resilience, they gain biological diversity simply by being left alone. And David, you talked about some situations where maybe that's not the best idea. You're in a plantation, or there are invasives or other things that really, sometimes ditches that need to be plugged. But once those problems are solved, I would say that many forests can do fine and will do fine and will become old forest and eventually old growth forest over time. And so I want to focus on, for a minute, just thinking of wildlands. Wildlands as the future of old growth, as future old growth forests. So there was a region-wide, New England-wide report, Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, that was published in 2017, that has a vision for New England's landscape that includes some wildland, some actively managed land, protected farmland, and vibrant communities. I want to point to also to a more recent publication. This one came out just recently, Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, which talks about the interplay of these components of the active management and passive management. The title is a little confusing, but it's a great publication, and I encourage you to go ahead and look at that. And then we have Vermont. In Vermont here, we have Vermont Conservation Design, which has goals really quite similar to the goals of the regional study, Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities. It identifies that a portion, approximately 9 to 10% of the landscape, should be protected as old forest that is allowed to mature on its own. And the remaining forest to be conserved as actively managed forest, but managed carefully. And the diagram is hard to read, but the map, you can see that all of the green shows the totality of forest blocks that the Vermont Conservation Design identified as priority areas for conservation. And within each biophysical region, which are the black delineated regions on this map, there are goals for old forest and actually goals also for young forest. You don't have to read the details, but if you want to look at this report, I encourage you to do so. Then we have in 2022 to implement some of these ideas and help get some of these ideas moving forward. The use value appraisal program in 2022 was revised so that one can enroll part of one's property in the reserve forest, a new category called reserve forest land. So a parcel of land that you own can be enrolled in this category if it has significant and sensitive conditions, like ecologically significant treatment areas, which is a term in the UVA, use value appraisal or current use language. And these are generally rare natural communities, significant natural communities, rare plants, and things like that. Or if it has steep slopes or unproductive land like wetlands, special places, and sensitive sites. Then you can enroll your parcel in this reserve forest land, and you can choose to manage it actively, or you can choose not to. You can choose to let it be what it will be over time, passive management as we describe it. Then, more recently in 2023, Act 59 was passed in Vermont. The Vermont Community Resilience and Biodiversity Act of 2023, sponsored by Representative Amy Sheldon in our legislature. And it identifies 3 categories of conserved areas, very mirroring these other ideas: biodiversity reserves, or wildlands; ecological conservation areas, or woodlands, as the Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities report calls it; and sustainable resource management areas, which are also actively managed woodlands. It does not lay out the percentage of each of these, but people are working now to implement Act 59 and determine what these numbers are. But what it does do is it refers heavily to Vermont conservation design. So it is assumed that the guidelines within Vermont conservation design will are going to affect the implementation of Act 59, and that's what people are working on. Some really great people are working on right now. So that's really exciting. That's very exciting. In addition to this act, there was another act that was passed last year, 2024, Act 181, which updates Act 250, which also calls in the goals of Vermont conservation design. So all these things are coming together, are playing together, and there's a lot of great cooperation and collaboration around these goals, around these multiple goals. This is just a chart from Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities that shows the goals on the right-hand side of what is called for. So 30 million acres of conserved forest in the region, 90% of that woodlands, meaning actively managed forest, but carefully managed, and then 10% wildlands. And then 3 to 6 million acres of conserved farmland and 5 million acres of developed land. And the map on the right shows the current condition in New England. So you see where the forest-dominated areas are in northern Maine and in our Green Mountains and in the White Mountains. And then you can see where the farmland is, which is in Vermont, in the Champlain Valley. So that's the goals. And these goals, as I said, are mirrored here in Vermont's Vermont conservation design. Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities came out in 2022 with this report, which did an assessment of where are we with wildlands in New England? How much of the landscape actually is present in wildlands? We said a few minutes ago that 0.1% of New England is in old forest and old growth forest currently, vastly down from its original extent. But how much of that is, how much land, this is a different question, how much land is actually permanently protected so that it can become old forest in the future? Not necessarily old forest now, but permanently legally protected. And this was actually quite a massive data gathering effort, which involved talking to Vermont Land Trust and many other conservation organizations to find out, of your portfolio of protected land, of conserved land, how much of it is actually protected as wildland. And so in the case of Vermont Land Trust, a certain portion of it is a smallish portion. Within the case of the Nature Conservancy, more in the case of Northeast Wilderness Trust, that's what they do. So quite a lot of what they protect has that designation. So what are wildlands? Wildlands are tracts of any size and current condition permanently protected from development, in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural ecological processes to prevail with free will. And there's just some examples of wildlands that are protected throughout New England: Colchester Bog in Vermont, Monhegan Island in Maine, Muddy Pond in a suburban area of Massachusetts, and the iconic Baxter State Park in Maine, which is the largest wildland in New England. Doesn't compare to the Adirondack Park, but in New England itself, that is the largest wildland. So 80%, the findings of the report are summarized here. 81% of New England is forest. That's not surprising. 3.3 is protected permanently as wildland. And you can see the wildlands identified on this map. And you can see in northern Maine, Baxter is a large one. And if you look at Vermont, if you look at Vermont, you can see that most of the wildlands are found on the spine of the Green Mountains. So in the Green Mountain National Forest as wilderness areas, and then many state lands. And there are also some private conserved land, and just some examples of some of the wildlands. This is the top of Mount Mansfield, which is protected as a wildland. It's owned by the University of Vermont, and it is designated as a UVM natural area. And so it is protected. This is another one, very different. This is a low elevation, lowland, old growth black gum swamp in the southwestern corner of Vermont, in Vernon, Vermont. And it is protected as a wildland. It's a small area, but really quite different. And then we have some of these areas that are kind of extremes. And then we have a few areas like this, which doesn't necessarily look like, it's not an old forest now. It's not an old growth forest now. And going back to Mount Mansfield, of course, Mount Mansfield, those stubby little trees, as David said, the old forests don't necessarily have big trees. Those little stunted black spruce at the top of Mount Mansfield could be considered old growth, even though they're tiny. And then here we have a young forest that is not a mature forest. It will look quite different when it is old growth, but it is protected as wildland. But the problem is that these lower elevation forests like this, calcareous forests with lots of spring wildflowers, those are white trilliums, we don't have enough of this kind of forest protected. So that's a goal that we're working on right now, is to identify more low elevation areas that could be protected as old forests. I'm going to conclude now with a couple of, I'm just going to invite you to read From the Ground Up, which is a publication of Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities in our upcoming issue 6, which will be published in March. We're going to have a whole series on ecological forestry, which will bring in some of the topics that David discussed. But I really hope that you'll check out this issue, this journal. It's really a wonderful journal, and I hope you'll check it out. Also, save the date. There is a conference on wildlands and old growth forests, a vision for the future, in September of this year. It'll be held in person and virtual. And just keep your eyes out for that. A few books, a few resources. There's a million of them. This is just a handful of some of the books that I've enjoyed related to old growth forests. And when we send you follow-up information, we'll send you a list of resources. So that's what I have, and I would like to we would like to open the room for questions, and I'll.
Yeah, thank you so much. So thank you all so much for putting your questions into the Q&A. We definitely have a lot of them. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll start with one of the ones that got the most interest. So it's about invasive species and how they play a role in old growth. So if you could talk a little bit about how, as the future of invasives, and how, as we manage, especially with having canopy release and things like that, how they tie into old growth.
Yeah, real quick, they're definitely a big concern, and I think, as I sort of mentioned before, in some situations you have to work on getting those addressed, and unfortunately the best way is with chemicals. So certainly in our area, it's like trying to get those out of there, let some of that, because what they'll do is they'll choke out the natural regeneration, and so you need to deal with them. I probably once the forest gets into a more old forest condition, it might be able to combat some of that on its own. Anything, Liz?
Yeah, one thing we don't know much about,
but
with research
research is
ongoing on this, is will some of the invasive species actually just blink out naturally over time in an old growth forest? And there is some evidence that some of them will, some of them won't, maybe, and some of them will. The Northeast Wilderness Trust has research going on, starting to do some research, and others, Highstead Foundation and Faison's work, people are looking at long-term monitoring of old growth forests to see how things change over time, including the presence of invasives. So it's something we don't know very much about. And trust and faith in the old forest to sort of manage that aspect of it, that's one of the trickiest ones, I think, one of the most challenging.
Thank you. Liz, I wonder, I don't know if I didn't quite get all of that through the audio, so there's a chance, apologies folks if you didn't catch the end of Liz's answer there. The next question is about American chestnut, and I'll just read this one. So, was the American chestnut part of the old growth pre-colonization and pre-blight? How do you feel about the introduction of the hybrids being developed and some active management?
Okay, I think, so the question of whether we're interested in, I think some of these species, American chestnut is one of them. American elm is another species that.
okay, Sam. Yes, okay. So an American elm is another one that people are restoring with material, genetic material from other species, and combining disease-resistant species or subspecies with and reintroducing those. And I think that brings real hope. I mean, I've personally believed that the diversity of species that we could maintain, some of those species provide such important functions in our forest. Chestnut did, it's almost completely gone. American elm is such an important species, particularly in floodplains. And the Nature Conservancy, I know, is doing quite a lot of work in restoration of American elm, and perhaps chestnut as well. So I think this is really important and good work. I'm encouraged by it myself.
Excellent, thank you. So the next question is about climate and climate crisis in general. So as we get more flooding, droughts, wildfires, things like that, how will old forests respond? And I'm going to tie in, somebody else had a question specifically about leaving some larger growth. Will they be more susceptible to wind events, and how could that tie in as well?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about this when I was looking at those two graphs where it's saying the passive approach takes, century or two, and wondering if some of the climate, some of that stuff is being now compressed. So I think it definitely will impact, but it might speed up kind of what naturally this dynamic that's going on anyway. Yeah, and leaving legacy trees and those kind of things, they're going to probably blow over. It's just that's the cycle that's going on. So you have to think through that as a landowner, how much of that you're willing to tolerate. If you want to go the true passive way and just let it fall, I mean, it's got a lot of value once it hits the ground too. And unfortunately, we can't you can't put a value on the ecological benefits of a lot of this stuff. All we can do is put the value when it's sold to a mill. What else, Liz?
In terms of flooding and fire, flooding, old forests are incredibly important in keeping the water on the forest and preventing downstream flooding. So I think that is just having more complex forests, whether they're managed for that complexity or left as old growth, it's going to be, you said keep forests as forests. That's a number one, keep the forest as forests, but older forests have more ability to keep water on the landscape and prevent it from flooding downstream. Fire is not a big, I am thinking of the devastating, of course, we're all thinking about the devastating fires happening in California right now. Just horrible, horrible. And we are fortunate in the Northeast in that our forests don't naturally burn. Very, very infrequently, there's certain situations where natural fires can take place, but it's really an uncommon occurrence. So it's not a huge threat here in the Northeast. Sometimes people call our forests the asbestos forest. But in presently what we're looking at with climate change in New England is more precipitation, not less. And so we worry a little bit more about that aspect of things. But wind, fire, yes. And as you said, trees become are vulnerable. Big trees are vulnerable to falling, but that's part of the whole dynamic.
Great. Well, I think we are just about at time. So I think, unfortunately, we can't get to the rest of the questions. We will definitely read over the questions, and as we are best able to, put some resources in that follow-up email that I'll be sending. So thank you all so much. Again, I will be sending an email which will have links to resources as well as a survey. And as well as the recording of this. It will take a few days for that to process, but it'll be up as soon as we can. Also, if anybody is out there looking for SAF credits, please just reply to that email and I will get you hooked up with a certificate as well. So again, thank you so much. We couldn't do the work that we do without you. So if you can head to vlt.org/support or /donate if you're able to make a donation. We do also have some upcoming events. We have another webinar coming up. It's a collaboration with Vermont Folklife. It's on January 28th. We also have a ski happening with the Catamount Outdoor Center. We're having a ski and snowshoe event up at Bluffside in Newport. And Liz will be joining us again in March for a webinar about spring wildflowers. So hopefully you can join one of those. You can find out about those and keep an eye on other events, which will be coming online soon at vlt.org/events. So thank you all so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone.